Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar, Envisioning Lessons with Multimedia Tech Sets. My name is Chelsea Murphy and I'm the Marketing Manager here at Listenwise. I am also joined by Jim Bentley, a Listenwise user and a 5th and 6th grade classroom teacher from Elk Grove Unified School District in California. Great to have you, Jim.
Thanks for having me tonight.
For those that are new and don't know about Listenwise, here's a quick overview of who we are before we dive into the webinar. Listenwise is an award-winning listening skills platform. We use NPR stories and podcasts to help students build listening and literacy skills for grades 5 through 12. We have over 1,000 stories on our platform, and they are all accessible to listen for free in your classroom with a teacher account. In Listenwise Premium, you can access our listening quizzes, interactive transcripts, and more robust lesson supports. And if you sign up for free today, you can opt into a 30-day free trial of Listenwise. A couple housekeeping items before I turn to Jim. We'd love for you to introduce yourselves in the chat box and share who you are if you haven't already. As we are presenting, please feel free to share comments and questions throughout the webinar in the chat box, and Jim and I will answer all of them at the end of the webinar. You can also email me directly at chelsea@listenwise.com for any questions you have about Listenwise. And I've also posted the dial-in number in the chat box if you have any audio troubles throughout this half hour. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand off to our Listenwise user, Jim Bentley, a California native who has taught for over 20 years, who currently teaches at Elk Grove Unified School District in California. He's also a National Geographic Fellow, and he's going to talk about innovative teaching strategies in the classroom, specifically how to build multimedia tech sets with Listenwise and other resources. Here's Jim.
Hey, thank you, Chelsea, and thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar. If you've seen Simon Sinek's TED Talk on how great leaders inspire action, you know that understanding and communicating why we do something sometimes is even more important than knowing or communicating how we do it or even what we do. People don't buy what we do, Sinek would argue, they buy why we do it. So tonight as teachers, let's think about what we clearly know. We know what we teach, a grade level, a subject, a specific unit or topic. And if you're like most teachers, you buy books or engage in, say, professional development or attend webinars such as this to learn more about how we refine our teaching practices. But as teachers, sometimes we forget to identify and question for ourselves why we teach. It's not just for a test, and it's not just because of a list of standards that was printed somewhere. Well, the context of Simon Sinek's TED Talk was a how-to for leaders to inspire people in the private sector to perform. I would argue it's also applicable to an educational setting as well. So rather than viewing ourselves as, say, teachers, what if we defined ourselves as leaders of learning expeditions in our own classrooms? What if we viewed our students as fellow explorers? And what if we nudged the purpose of teaching and learning and schooling away from merely covering content toward a more personally relevant, rigorous, and impactful goal, that of changing the world? On the 7th floor of National Geographic headquarters in Washington, D.C., there's a motto that perfectly summarizes the why for my teaching. I teach each day so that kids can learn about the world and how it works, and so they can make it a better place. I've adopted this National Geographic Education's motto as my own personal why. And I would challenge you to consider your own why after this webinar as well. Whether you teach history or English language arts or science or math, I believe each of us has an obligation to our students to not just cover content, but to teach deeply and to empower our students to connect what they're learning in our classrooms to the world around them so they can make it a better place. That said, I find that inspiring kids is one of the biggest ways to make them want to learn. We don't teach kids if they don't want to be taught. They need to be inspired. So how do we empower kids then to make the world a better place? I would say the first step is doing away with the passive student mindset and developing a more active mindset of an explorer. The second step is to look at why we teach through different lenses. In 2014, National Geographic created its learning framework. It identifies the key attitudes, skills, and knowledge of a National Geographic explorer, and every day, more than 6,000 National Geo explorers around the world are applying what they've learned in school to understand our world and to take action to make it a better place. Here, you can see a list of attitudes, skills, and knowledge areas. And yes, I'll share the links to this full framework and the other resources we'll cover at the end of the webinar. So we all know that school budgets and time are constraints on what we can do with our students. We can't literally take a field trip to the Okavango Delta with National Geographic explorer Steve Boys and his team to study the importance of, say, water in an ecosystem. But we can integrate the National Geographic Learning Framework with their new Geo-Inquiry process to get students actively inquiring and learning about the world and how it works so that they might act to make it a better place. Geo-Inquiry was the result of this learning framework. It was launched in early 2017, and it's really a 5-step process where students ask geographic questions about an issue that's personally relevant to them. They collect data from the web, they print resources, or they actually collect data out in the field, and then they visualize it from multiple perspectives and on varying scales to create a compelling story to support an action that they want to take. It's an exciting and rigorous process that I've used with my middle school students. We've studied how we can responsibly dispose of organic waste to lessen greenhouse gas emissions. We've explored how to properly dispose of household hazardous waste. And this year, our Geo-Inquiry is addressing this topic. How can we make water more accessible in our community? Now, if Geo-Inquiry or National Geographic Learning Framework is something that you'd like to know more about and to bring into your own classroom, you can visit the Ed Certification webpage to join the 2018 cohort, which starts in spring or winter of this year. Again, I'll have a link to this website at the end of the webinar. So whether you're using, say, a Geo-Inquiry process or you're using a more traditional approach involving lecture and textbooks, a multimedia text set is an excellent tool to give students a 360-degree view of the subject that you're teaching. Again, we're talking about the why, and now we're moving into the how. Multimedia text sets can come in all shapes and sizes, and they're similar to hyperdocs, if you've heard of those, which are essentially entire lessons that are bundled into an interactive Google Doc or slide deck. For more information on hyperdocs, I would strongly recommend that you check out Lisa Heifel, Sarah Landis, or Kelly Hilton on Twitter, or the Hyperdoc handbook that they co-authored. Multimedia text sets are a way to get a student interacting with a topic and a device to consume information about that topic. They might also ask a student to, say, do something to help them process the information they've consumed. Now, you can build a multimedia text set using an interactive Google Doc or Google Slide like the one you see here. You can access this Google Slide multimedia text set, by the way, if you take a look at the short link on the page, and I believe this is also listed at the end as well. Last year, my students were studying climate change, and it became apparent that we needed to dive deeply into the carbon cycle. So as we studied climate change, I realized a multimedia text set was going to be very helpful. Now, this was new for 6th grade students, so what I opted to do was to give them 2 different looks at the carbon cycle. One was a film clip enhanced with EdPuzzle, and one other media piece was a written article from Newsella. Students first watched the EdPuzzle, and then they answered questions that I had embedded in it. And then students selected a Newsella article that connected to one of the 11 signs of climate change. Now, this graphic that you see here is from the EPA's Student Guide to Climate Change, and it's worth noting it's no longer being maintained under the current administration. What you see is a series of text titles that correlate to the different indicators of climate change. Students were able to tap on this, and they were able to go to an article related to that. So if they wanted to read about stronger storms as a sign of climate change, they can go to a Newsella article that dealt with that. If they wanted to look at thawing permafrost, they were able to tap on that to go to a Newsella article that related to that topic as well. Afterwards, after students read widely and viewed the EdPuzzle, they worked with partners to identify the central idea of the video and also the text they'd read. And then they were also asked to address a writing prompt. The writing prompt would have been addressed after having taken notes on the 2 different media pieces, the print piece and the video piece, and then the writing prompt itself you see here. So this was a result of reading, but also viewing video. Now, I could have easily substituted, say, a Listenwise audio story in place of the EdPuzzle video, but This was a choice that I made purposefully because it was a new topic to them, carbon cycle, so I really wanted to appeal to those visual learners. And also, I wanted to stick with 2 different sources of media. I could have added the Listenwise as a 3rd piece, but since this was a first attempt for this class to deal with the multimedia text set, I didn't want to overwhelm them as much. The Listenwise pieces that you can see here all correlate to carbon cycle. They all have something to do with climate change, and all of those pieces would have been serviceable for that multimedia text set. Here is another multimedia text set. This one's a little bit different. This time I'm using Newsella's text set feature. What you can see is a series of articles that I was able to find on Newsella and I was able to add to this text set. Above that, what you'll see are a series of instructions. Now these instructions are where the magic can kind of happen. What you'll see are a series of words. They're blue, they're hyperlinks out to various things. This multimedia text set involves Newsella articles once more, but you'll also see a link out to the website for Water for South Sudan. We'd read the book A Long Walk to Water by Linda Sue Park. We understood the critical nature of water in southern Sudan and as part of the Sudanese Civil War. Here's a website link out to the BBC News story about the recent Sudanese war. This link, The Lost Boys of Sudan, actually goes out to a PBS documentary about the Lost Boys. I also have a series of human rights PSAs that are produced on a YouTube channel. You can see 30 PSAs about 30 human rights, one of which is water. We also have links out to Listenwise articles about the Lost Boys of Sudan, and also a news story about Listenwise news story about southern Sudan and what its conditions are today. This multimedia text set, by the way, on Newsella is also available at this short link. It's a bit.ly link. ALWT stands for A Long Walk to Water text set. This is public. You can access this and use these Newsella articles and these websites in your own. So ultimately, why would we want to use, say, a Newsella or a Listenwise or a Google Doc text set when it would be a lot easier to use, say, a PowerPoint and handouts and just tell the students what we want them to know for the test? When we tell students what we want them to know, it's not really empowering them to explore and to discover and to want to change the world for their own personal reasons. If it's a task, it's one thing. If it's a personal quest, it's a totally different thing. Also, too, when students are exploring multimedia text sets like this, what I find is that the items that they're covering stay in long-term memory quite a bit more. If we really want to teach our students to retain this, we've got to tap into that power of narrative and storytelling and exploration and questioning on the part of students. And we really have to value their interests and their wonderings and scaffold their inquiry by offering them quality experiences with quality materials. Now, this year, my students are going to be working on a geo-inquiry where they're studying how human rights connect to water. And they're also going to be collecting data to answer this question: how can we make water more accessible in our community? We're going to look at this from a global and also local scale. We'll look at this through various perspectives. And in the process, we will use multimedia text sets. And my students will need a lot of background information, much of which they'll get from those multimedia text sets. This is the how part of what I'm relying on to teach these kinds of things. So what do I use to build a multimedia text set? What do I use to build these different geographic perspectives, these local, regional, and global perspectives, these different perspectives of a geographic thinking, from spatial thinking to cultural to political thinking? Really, this is our geographic perspective in an image. The what I use is pretty clear. One thing is Listenwise. I do love Listenwise as a resource. I love how students are able to access the questions, the quizzes, the graphic organizers, with close listening in the transcripts. I also love how students are able to slow down the audio of the Listenwise articles. Another tool that I find I use that's absolutely indispensable is Newsella. Newsella rewrites articles at 5 different lexiles. They allow annotations of text. They offer quizzes, write prompts, and they're adding new features each week. For example, Power Words is a new feature that rolled out, which gives students a chance to interact with Tier 2 vocabulary words in the context of the article. And finally, another piece that I use to build a multimedia text set is EdPuzzle. EdPuzzle allows you to take video clips from YouTube or Vimeo. You can bring these videos in through a URL, and you can also upload videos to EdPuzzle too, as long as they're not copyrighted. Essentially, EdPuzzle will allow you to add multiple choice or short answer questions or opportunities for students to write and reflect. You can even add an audio note with your own voice. You can choose the places that you want students to pause and reflect. And you can also disallow skipping so that when students are watching the video, they can't skip ahead. You can even add text comments where you can write out something that you want students to note. You can bring in hyperlinks and send them out to websites or images, maybe say stored on a Google Drive or images that are on the web. It really truly makes watching a video interactive as compared to, say, playing a DVD and then pausing it and having a whole class discussion, which is what I did for about the first 19 years of my teaching career. So EdPuzzle really does allow you to make a video a lesson. So again, to recap, why do we want to have multimedia text sets? We want to give students access to a topic or an idea from more than one perspective. We want them to hear text through spoken word with Listenwise. We want them to read text, say, with Newsella. We want them to view and hear text and imagery with, say, videos that are enhanced by EdPuzzle. We want to give students a 360-degree view so that they can really explore and understand and ask questions that can help guide your instruction of them during a topic. Multimedia text sets are interesting. They're not textbooks, which can be quite boring. Multimedia text sets are different. They're not just you, the teacher, talking. They are involving students exploring and looking at things and hearing and seeing things on their own terms. And ultimately, multimedia text sets are something that will hopefully inspire our students to want to take ownership of the learning and to try and make the world a better place because they care about it. Really, ultimately, that's the why. Why do students want to learn? Well, they want to learn because they're compelled to learn. So multimedia text sets, very new thing for many of us, something that some of us have maybe been doing for a while. I find that every time I approach building a multimedia text set, there's always something new that I'm learning or something new that I'm adding. So I would encourage you to really consider bringing them into your repertoire and thinking about how you might try to use these with your own students. Chelsea, I'll show the links that we have here, and I know that this webinar will be recorded so people can access these on a more timely manner. You don't want to write these down now. But that really concludes much of the new information I want to share. Do we have any questions or any comments or things that we want to address at this time from viewers or things that you see that we want to bring in?
Great, thanks, Jim. I'll make sure also to have these links available in the follow-up email. So I think I did send out the bit.ly link and that's not quite working. So I'll make sure all these links will be in the follow-up emails for people to use as well.
Perfect, thank you.
Currently, I don't see any questions coming in. So if people have questions, feel free to type in the chat box. So I have one to get started. Say if there are teachers who are listening who haven't created text sets before, do you have any advice for them to get started or best practices that have been helpful for you, Jim?
Yeah, probably one of the easiest ways to get started, if you're able to use, like Google Docs, if you were to go shopping for articles that that you'd like students to see, if you were to go shopping for, say, websites that you want students to refer to, or even YouTube videos, EdPuzzle is great, but if that's something that you're not willing to jump into right away, that's not a problem. As long as you grab your media resources and if you bring them into, say, a Google Doc, you can hyperlink them in, or you can even just copy the URLs and have them clickable for students. If you're wanting to give students a paper handout that they could take home with them as maybe like a sort of a flipped classroom model where they're viewing these things ahead of time, and you can't necessarily guarantee that they can access those Google Docs at home, there's nothing wrong with, say, using a short link website like bit.ly or goo.gl, the Google shortening website link. Make a nice short link, give it to students that they can actually type in. Usually I try to approach a multimedia text set from, I'd like to have a reading experience, a viewing experience, and a listening experience. I'll be honest, before I found Listenwise, the listening experience was always the hardest one to find. I would shop around an NPR website or Cap Radio, which is my local website, to bring in those links. Sometimes I look for podcasts as well, but you can start small and start simple. 2 sources is better than 1, so start with 2, maybe go to 3. That would be my first step recommendation.
Great. And do you, I guess, with using the Listenwise, do you have any sort of best practice for setting up your students to get focused on listening? Because I know just listening isn't always a tool that students are used to doing.
Yeah, I would strongly recommend spending a solid good couple weeks, 2 weeks of going through and listening to a Listenwise piece as a student, as a whole class, and kind of show them, model the thinking. I would encourage you to add yourself to your own class so that you can actually go through the process and see the student view, to do the student response. I find that the written responses drastically improved once we started modeling what level of specificity I'm looking for in terms of the writing. To have students going through the process with you, to see that thinking, to have them watch you model the thinking, that was really powerful, because it is such a strange new experience for a lot of students. They're not used to listening to the radio to gather information. They're used to listening to the radio for entertainment. So it's a totally different stance. I'd also say too that if you've read or seen any of Kylene Beer's work on Notice and Notes, signposts for reading nonfiction, a lot of the things that she talks about in terms of a stance for listening or a stance for reading, those would be helpful too. Simple questions like, what surprised me, or what did the author assume I knew, or what seemed to be the most important thing. Some of those questions that she offers are really helpful things to give students when they're approaching listening to a piece of text.
Awesome. That sounds great. And we have another question that came in. What would you consider to be essential elements or critical attributes of an effective multimedia text set?
That's a really good question. Make sure the media is not too long. There's quite a bit of research that you can look at on the viewability of, say, videos. And after 2 minutes, the viewer rate tanks. It absolutely drops abysmally low. So as you start out looking for video clips, 2 minutes or less are great. 3 minutes can work, but you're going to lose kids. So that would be one thing that is essential. I would also say too that as you're selecting either text or audio, to really make sure that it's not too high a level, which is one of the reasons why I like Mozilla, because they can Lexile, the text up or down. Another thing that might be helpful is if you were to identify, say, really key important tier 3 vocabulary that's very content specific, it might be helpful to have a definition, a very simple definition that might help scaffold the students' initial understanding of that. Those would be a couple of things I would definitely consider as you're building your first multimedia text sets.
Great. So it looks like those are all the questions. So if anybody has any outstanding questions, they can feel free to reach out to Jim. You can see his information is on the page right here, or myself, Chelsea at listenwise.com. And I will also make sure that if you have a question for Jim, that gets passed along to him as well. So thank you, Jim, for presenting today. It was very informative.
And thank you, Chelsea. I appreciate it.
Great. And then I hope everyone who's listening found this webinar informative as well. So we will be sending out a PDF of this PowerPoint deck and a recording of the webinar in the coming days, along with all the resources that Jim, all those links that he sent out as well. So you all will have those. And if anyone would like a PD certificate, feel free to email me and I would be happy to send that along as well. And lastly, if you don't currently have a Listenwise account, you can sign up for free at listenwise.com and you can opt into 30 days of Listenwise Premium. So thank you all. Thank you, Jim, and have a great rest of your evening.